Lovely. Well, I'd like to introduce you to Oliver Lewis, who has written this book about his travels through Orwell's life. Um, I certainly found it very interesting and informative, and I'm sure you will too. Oliver, over to you.
Thank you. So I thought I'd start the talk by going through each chapter, so each path of my journey through the life and work of George Orwell. Before I do that, I'll start off by explaining why the Odyssey began in the way that it did, and it wasn't planned. I didn't do the Anna Funder thing of wanting to write a book about George Orwell. It evolved from a quite specific set of circumstances, which I'll explain in a moment. And then anyway, so I'll explain the background and context. Then I'll talk about each step of my journey. There are 14 chapters in the book in total. And then I will share some photographs from my travels and some my most interesting moments and talk through them. So George Orwell was my grandfather's favourite author and my father's favourite author, but didn't I didn't grow up with George Orwell being discussed at dinner or lunch, every evening. But he was always there, so I was always conscious of him from a very early age. So I'm the youngest of four children, so and my oldest brother's 10 years older than me. So discussions around, I don't know, what 1984 was as a concept was something I was probably exposed to at probably age 4 or 5. I know that sounds ridiculous, but that just would have been something that would have come up in conversation. My parents are both academics. My late father was a materials engineer, and my mother was an archaeologist. And so, anyhow, so the influence of George Orwell on my grandfather, who was a history academic, and then on my father, and also his brother, my uncle, and then on me is the sort of the lineage of the origin of the influence of George Orwell on my life, and subsequently on the beginning of my writing career. So the by the age of 27, 28, I'd read almost all of George Orwell's uh, novels and essays. In a sort of stop-start sort of fashion. I read Animal Farm at school. I think I read 1984 in the sixth form. And I distinctly remember taking Burmese days on my gap year to India. And then I sort of worked my way through Clergyman's Daughter, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, Coming Up for Air. And then in 2012, a friend of mine was seconded to San Francisco, and he had studied a lot of the essays of George Orwell in the sixth form. He did the International Baccalaureate, where there's a big emphasis on Orwell's essays. And we were talking about the trip, and he said, "What are you going to bring to read?" And I said, "I'm thinking about bringing George Orwell's essays." And he said, "Oh, how have you not read them already? You must make sure you read all of them." So I took the volume of that, read through them. And so, but by 2016, 2017, I had read, most of the novels and the essays. And what happened was a very sort of funny set of circumstances. So I was educated at the London School of Economics for my undergraduate degree, which was in history and politics. And unfortunately, like many people at the LSE, I did the keep the aspidistra flying thing of chasing a job in the city, Canary Wharf, etc. So I went to work for HSBC, and then I later then moved to the Royal Bank of Scotland. And I really hated the job, hated every aspect of office life, and so the dream of chasing the money god shattered very quickly, as lessons we'll all be familiar with from Keep the Aspidistra Flying. And so I decided I'm going to do a master's before I'm 30, and there was a good course lined up at King's College London, and so I applied for it, was accepted, and then of course I resigned, put on some form of gardening leave, and I had a very long summer before my master's program was due to start. And so over the course of that summer, totally independently of the idea to pursue this book, I taught very briefly in Calcutta before starting at HSBC, and the couple who ran the school from Dorset own a very small Scottish island, not that far from Jura, so the other side of Scarborough, off the coast of Ling, one of the Slate Islands. And they had said, "You must come up and stay with us. It's such a beautiful place. You can see Mull and all the rest of it." And so I said, "Yeah, no, I'll come this summer. I'll come and stay with you." And the second thing that happened is that a friend of mine from university said he wanted to go backpacking in Burma, Myanmar. So I said, yeah, well, I've always been on my list, you know, and obviously Burma at that point was open to tourists. So I said, yeah, definitely, I'll come with you for that. Flights, everything was booked for that. And then the third thing was that another one of my close friends from university, his parents live near Southwold, and they said, you know, come up for a week. It'd be great, you know, to explore Suffolk, go cycling trips and everything. And then it suddenly dawned on me as I was sort of planning the travel for these three locations that having, you know, known enough about Orwell's life, that these three places, Southwold, Jura, and obviously Burma, Myanmar, were very closely associated with the life of George Orwell. And I then thought, well, given I'm going to each of these three places, two of which are obviously quite remote, Myanmar and Jura, Isle of Ling, why don't I do the whole life and do every place on the Orwell Trail, so to speak? And so I thought, well, this is such, you know, an interesting idea. Surely someone must have done it before. So I did a bit of research just to see whether anybody had done so. And it turned out they hadn't, to my future fortune. There obviously, as I'm sure many people on the call will know, various books have been written about specific locations. There's Emma Larkin's very good book, Finding George Orwell in Burma, which was actually a very good seller, you know, commercially in terms of publishing. It was reprinted, paperback, yada yada yada, translated, so on and so forth. And Will Self and Madeline Bunting have written not whole books, but some chapters of books or journal articles, obviously about, you know, trips to Jura. And there are various books about pilgrimages to Wigan. But I felt, and this is one of the other motivations for writing the book, I felt the books about Wigan tend to be quite politicized. And I fear that quite a lot of people that write about Orwell, as I'm sure some people may sympathise with, perhaps we can discuss this in the discussion and the questions, but writing about George Orwell becomes an opportunity and an excuse to peddle one's own political opinions. And I felt, as I read more and more about Orwell's life, obviously as I was doing the travel for each location, doing the travelling, doing the research and preparation for each trip, the more I read, particularly the more recent sort of post-1980 texts, I felt they were overtly political. And so I wanted to produce something that didn't do that, you know, didn't focus on my own political biases, which of course I have, as every person has. And so to present Orwell's life in as neutral a way possible, but also one that explored his life through the prism of travel, which of course hadn't been done before for the entirety of his life. And the other thing I had in mind was to give Orwell, rejuvenate Orwell in the eyes of a millennial audience, because obviously travel has become relatively so much cheaper for my generation and the generations below me, and almost all of them often have heard of George Orwell, even those who haven't gone to university, because he's a very prominent feature on the national curriculum at Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4, so that's the old O-level GCSE age group. So I thought, well, you've got Orwell, who's sort of popular media presence is so great still. Think of Big Brother, Room 101, all the cliches we hear all around us. And then the love of travel for my generation and people who are younger than me. So putting them together, I thought the concept for the book would sell Orwell in an original way, and in a non one of the other things I found, along with the politicization of a lot of books about George Orwell, recent books about George Orwell, is that they tend to be really quite deep. And I felt with a lot of books I read, sometimes it was quite a lot, sort of wading through a lot of detail, which obviously I enjoyed. You know, I subsequently I started a doctorate, so I'm presently doing my doctorate at Oxford in modern British history. So you know, I don't shy away from detail. Love jumping into the minutiae of that. But obviously, it's not for everybody. And so I felt there wasn't really anything serving the market of people that are interested in George Orwell, don't want to read a full detailed biography, of which, of course, there are many, but equally would like to have more of a sense of his life and his significance. The other thing I suppose that was at the forefront of my mind was that obviously George Orwell, who obviously died in 1950, cannot do what I had intended to do, which was to explore every location and see how it had changed in the interim in the 70 years since his death. In a similar way, really, to I suppose what Emma Larkin did in Burma. So I suppose the direct inspiration, once I'd done the research to see whether anyone had done such a trip before, was Emma Larkin's book. And one of the issues with that book is that I felt it had dated very quickly because it was an assessment of the politics and government of Burma in, I think, 2003, 2004. And obviously those things change very quickly. The structure of government in a country like Myanmar, unfortunately, changes a lot. And so what I wanted to write was something that wouldn't date. So somebody could read it in 10 or 15 or 20 years and still get a sort of objective, neutral assessment of that place at that point of time in a way that doesn't feel worn by the passing of governments, elections, and circumstances, and all the rest of it. I didn't have an agent or a publisher when I started, so in fact I had never written anything properly before. I obviously had a history degree. A lot of the early writing was done while I was doing my history masters, and obviously now I am pursuing a full academic career, but didn't have an agent, didn't have a publisher, so I just started writing chapters. The first trip I did, another thing I must say is that the book wasn't written in chronological order because it was just impossible to sequence the travel in that way. And of course, the first three trips were the first three trips that permitted the synchronized, the whole concept of the book came out of the invitations to Burma, Jura, and Southwold. So those three chapters were written at the beginning. And when I drafted the chapter on Jura, I just farmed it out to friends, and I said, at that point, I was still, I think, just about. Well, I just left the banking industry, and my brain had sort of been destroyed really by years of PowerPoint decks and Excel spreadsheets and toxic office politics. And I said, do you enjoy it? Should I continue? Is it worth pursuing this? And without exception, they all came back and said, I absolutely loved it. So interesting to present Orwell's life in this way. Keep going. So I did chapter by chapter, did journey by journey, then put it all together, edited it as one document, then sent it to an agent or several agents, and then just before COVID, just before COVID, I got the agent. And I think during COVID, we then agreed the publication deal, and then obviously eventually publication date in July. So that's really the background and context to the book. So the book itself, I had to take, I'm afraid I only have one of the posh copies here, which is being given away as a Christmas present. But a coincidence has shown the hard copy with the cover. So there are 14 chapters in total. Yeah, that's the actual cover, which my family had I couldn't go because I had to work yesterday, but there was a sort of family reunion in Henley yesterday because my grandfather grew up or my grandfather lived near Henley, and my sister was in a bookshop in Henley, and of all people, Theresa May was leafing through my book in the bookshop in Henley. So read of that what you will. Perhaps her position on, or perhaps she's finding salvation in George Orwell in some way. I don't know if she bought it, but my sister said you'll never guess what saw today. So there are 14 chapters in total and locations. I had to. I had, while I was reading Orwell's work, in my 20s, I also loved travel writing, and I travelled quite a lot. One of the Orwell Society review commented that Oliver Lewis is clearly quite well travelled already by that point, and I had taken several gap years. I'd worked in India before, so and one of the complementary things the Orwell Society review wrote was that the travelogue aspect of the book there isn't lots of alarmism and sort of Orientalism at unusual sites. That obviously there are unusual sites, but they're not dressed up in a way to embellish them or make them seem alarmist. Because I don't think readers really are after that. And so in that respect, it's quite toned down. But I think that's partly a natural consequence of the fact that I had spent quite a lot of time in India already. So I obviously, in terms of the commercial appeal of the concept, I had to delicately balance chapters in England vis-a-vis chapters overseas, and to try and find the best possible blend I could find. So the order is Motihari, Bihar, India, obviously where Eric Blair was born in 1903. Henley-on-Thames, so which I just mentioned a moment ago. Eton College, Myanmar, historically of course known as Burma, Southwold, Paris, Hayes, Middlesex, Hampstead, Wallington, obviously the cottage, the stores in Wallington, Wigan, Catalonia, Marrakesh, Fitzrovia, Jura, and then final chapter, Sutton, Courtney. Some people may ask, perhaps we'll discuss this in the question stage, why did you choose to omit certain places? I did think about having a trip to St Cyprian's or the site of St Cyprian's, but obviously because it's no longer an active place of study, I decided against it. And again, it was sort of wishing to present Orwell's life in a way that didn't spend an overwhelming amount of time going through what George was doing on 5th of May 1912 or what have you. There is a little bit of that in the book. Obviously, there has to be. And as a historian, I'd be neglecting a biographical journey or assessment of his life by ignoring some of that stuff. But I just thought having a chapter on St Cyprian's would be too much detail, really, for the target audience that I'm hoping to reach. I also considered having a chapter on Shropshire to represent the childhood summers that were spent on Wenlock Edge. And again, I just thought it would mean an additional British chapter, which for British readers anyhow would feel a bit of a trudge through British locations. Of course, I couldn't ignore many of the UK locations because so much of Orwell's life was spent in Britain. So eventually I decided against a chapter on Tickleton Court. But I edited a lot of the book at a market town called Montgomery, which is on the Shropshire Powys border in the Welsh Marches, where I own a house. And Tickleton Court is not very far from Montgomery. And so for many, well, probably 5 or 6 years, but since I started the project, I've always been meaning to make it to Tickleton. And this summer, I thought, right, I'm going to do it. Going to do it today. So I drove to Church Stretton, and then it's off on a lane about 20 minutes from Church Stretton, which from my house is probably about a half an hour, 40-minute journey. So it was always very close, and I just never got round to going. So I did finally make it to Tickleton, and I am pondering whether in a future edition I might have a supplementary chapter on Tickleton, which was a very, very, very interesting place actually, and its unchanged nature, and it's still very little seems to have changed there since the First World War. It's in parts of Shropshire still are very out of the way, and Tickleton would definitely embody that sort of unchanging Shropshire the culture of Shropshire. And the circumstances of the house are very interesting. I'm sure some members of the trustees will have visited Tickleton, and possibly some of the people on the call as well. So I'm tempted to write a short addendum on Tickleton, because I do think his experiences there, that sort of unchanging English countryside, the views and housemen and so on, I think were probably a very big force in shaping his views and his attitudes, particularly to his love of England, which I identified as being a big thread of his life. So that was Tickleton and my choice of chapters. Again, Marrakesh did the winter they spent there. Eileen and Eric, did that justify a whole chapter? And I thought it did, because the writing of Coming Up for Air there, so many letters sent to and from Marrakesh, and obviously it was also an international location. Some chapters, of course, I couldn't ignore. I couldn't ignore the birthplace in India. I couldn't ignore Down and Out in Paris and London. Couldn't avoid Homage to Catalonia in the Spanish chapter. And then I sort of did debate, do I do Sutton Courtney as a chapter of its own? And then I thought, well, to weave the biography of Orwell from the beginning to the end. If you're going to put a lot of focus on where his parents met in India, his birth in Motihari, and then the detail around that, well, you can't really ignore then the really rather traumatic circumstances of the treatment, of his treatment for cancer, and then ultimately his death. So I thought that would be a more biographically centered chapter at the end there. The travel itself was, in some instances, extremely arduous. Motihari, I don't know if anybody on the call or trustees have been, but it is an incredibly remote part of northern India. And I did know that region quite well already because I had lived in Calcutta for 6 or 7 months. And for Bengalis, Bihar, and indeed for many Indians, Bihar is known as a bit of a wild west where, considered quite economically backward, very economically deprived, because it's one of the poorest states in India. And so I knew it might be quite tricky to navigate the roads and so on to get there. So instead, I flew to Kathmandu and had a very interesting experience to get to the border, which I describe in some detail in the book, but this sort of really quite dangerous bus that was sort of falling apart and sort of big Bollywood movies playing all night. I didn't get any sleep, and then eventually made it to the border, I think 4 a.m. And then getting from the border to Motihari, the various options: is it a bus? Is it a train? And then, as a historian, although it's not a history book, I didn't write it with the intention of it being a social history. Some reviewers and some commentators have said, well, actually, I do feel like it is a social history of the 20th century. And you might think, well, that's very odd because obviously Orwell died in 1950, but his life covered the first half of 20th century. And of course, what my book does is then update a perspective of these places over the past 70 years. So, for instance, the economic challenges of Wigan, the effects and consequences of Thatcherism and the deindustrialisation of Britain on Wigan, immigration in the case of Hayes and Harlington in Middlesex. So the various changes that have happened to these places since 1950 are incorporated. So it wasn't my intention, but I think because I am a trained historian, there is a loss of social history in there as well, which I think is quite an interesting takeaway for me, because that was obviously never the purpose or the intention of the work when I began the research for it. And of course, to contemporary readers and contemporary eyes, the whole idea that George Orwell was born in India is itself an unusual fact. Of course, it's very well known to all of us on this call, I'm sure, but for a lot of readers and so on who don't have much or very limited understanding of British imperial history, very odd. It comes as a surprise to many that actually Britain did govern India for, certainly in formal terms, almost 100 years with the British Raj, and obviously before that, the East India Company, and so on. And really, one thing that I drew from certainly the research on the chapter in India was the trade in people in India. They're still known as Britishers. The Britishers that would ply the ocean-going vessels between India and Britain. And of course, Orwell, really, I think his life needs to be seen in that context. There's very much an Anglo-Indian family. As many will know of his grandmother living in Moulmein when he was in the police force there in Burma. And because that world has entirely vanished and is consigned almost to history, I mean, the last people that lived in British India are now in their 90s and so on, and it's not taught very well in our schools, either in India or in Britain, it does feel like sort of a lost world. And so navigating a lot of the locations in Motihari or the old institutions of the British government of Burma was again quite a strange thing. It's sort of watching or seeing, a bit like an archaeologist, really, sort of clambering over some of these buildings. So the Pegu Club in Burma is one place that I describe in quite some detail. The Pegu Club was one of the elite clubs in Rangoon, modern day Yangon, of which Orwell was a member, and it's now totally derelict. And I explored it right in the middle of a huge storm, and my experiences there, I think, some reviewers have said, are quite interesting and moving. I also had a methodological challenge as a British writer writing almost half the book are chapters set in Britain. And so I was having to force myself to be an objective, dispassionate observer of places that were very familiar to me. So Henley, I've been going to since I was a toddler. I know my way around the town, the culture of the town very well. I hadn't been to Southwold before, but because my best friend grew up in Suffolk, I was quite familiar with the culture of rural Suffolk. I used to work. I worked in Edinburgh briefly. I hadn't been to that area of the Hebrides before, but I'd been to other parts of the Highlands and other Hebridean islands. So again, I was quite familiar with the slow pace of life there, and that proximity to the elements, which also is not necessarily so much of a feature of many parts of the rest of Britain, and certainly not as inaccessible as other parts of Britain. My brother lives in Paris. I've been to Paris quite a lot, and again familiar with Saint-Germain-des-Prés and so on. So that I felt was a methodological challenge, and I always thought that it would be the international chapters that would be more interesting, would sell the book. But I'm very pleased to say that the Orwell Society said, or the reviewer for the Orwell Society commented that they favoured the British chapters over the international ones. So I'm very pleased that was one of the outcomes of the Orwell Society review, because so I was very aware that I had to try, I was trying to be a Paul Theroux or a Bill Bryson, but in my own land, and being very conscious and knowledgeable of the culture of those places. Clearly, the logistical elements for travel to Hayes and Harlington, Wallington, were not as difficult as the more remote places. In preparation for each chapter, I would reread every major work. So Marrakesh, I obviously read the short essay on Marrakesh. The Spanish chapter, I reread Homage to Catalonia. And I would also read all the letters, minor news articles, news journal articles, and some other contemporary accounts in preparation for each trip. And then sort of a bit like a historian writing a dissertation, I would sort of collate that information and then transpose it into my travel experiences. I really wanted to give the book momentum, so I didn't want it to be a trudge through, either as a travelogue, the journey that I undertook, or a trudge through the work of George Orwell and or his life. And so I tend to flip quite a lot between, this is what George was doing here, this is why he came to Marrakesh, this is what Eileen was doing with him, this is what the domestic life was like here, and then I'll switch to, oh, I saw a donkey on the side of the road. George Orwell comments on donkeys in his essay and the condition and the treatment of animals in Marrakesh. And then what I had for lunch, or what I thought of the local cuisine on my trip there. And the feedback thus far seems to be very complementary to that model, to that approach, because at no point do I overtell, do I give too much information away, because then I then switch to something else I was doing, or something else that I found interesting. Don't think I have anything more to say on the chapters, so I think I might now switch to discussion of the photographs. So I've got a selection of photographs which are my sort of favoured choice, and that will give some more context, obviously, to the journey. We debated at length whether there should be photographs or maps in the book, and because and I'm glad to say the bookshop in Henley that Theresa May was looking at yesterday, it was in the travel section next to Bill Bryson, Paul Theroux, and so on. Some bookshops have put it in the biography section. Some have put it in sort of general hardback, new hardback. But obviously some are also putting it in the travel section. And my view is it should really be in the travel section, because that was the motivation and the origins of it lay in travel. But for that reason, we eventually settled on maps. And I met this is the map of France, of Paris. And because I work in Oxford, I very fortuitously chose to go through the Christmas market, which hitherto I'd always avoided. And on that one day, I thought, no, I walked past Balliol College, through the Christmas market, and I saw a stall there, an artist selling some watercolors. I'd been looking at that time for an illustrator and I approached various friends. You know, I knew the style I wanted, and I saw her work. Her name is Brittany Davies, and I said, "Oh, you wouldn't illustrate books, would you?" She said, "Well, I haven't done it before, but you know, I'd be really interested in exploring that." And so I opted instead for maps, because I'd found the type of illustrator that I thought would do the book justice, and but also because I wanted my descriptions of various locations to fuel the imagination of the reader rather than fall back on photographs. One or two reviewers have said they would have liked some photographs. So in the talks I've done in bookshops and so on, I've instead said, well, you know, here is the deck of photographs that will help show that. But the reason for choosing maps in the end, and it was actually more expensive to put maps in than it would have been to put photographs in from the publisher's perspective, was to fuel the imagination. So I'll now share the PowerPoint deck and take you through some of my favourite and most memorable photographs. So I hope everybody can see that. So this is Nainital. So the first place I went to in India was Motihari, so the place of birth. And then I'd wanted to go to Nainital because this was obviously where the Blair story began. It's where his parents met and were married. And I've always had a bit of an affinity for the Himalayas. When I lived in Calcutta, myself and some of my colleagues would go up to Darjeeling at weekends and you know, see Everest, see the Himalaya. So it's much cooler than down in Calcutta or on the plains. And so the hill station thing had always really appealed to me, and I'd not heard of Nainital before I'd started researching the life of George Orwell. So I thought, and obviously the fact that his parents met and married there, you know, it's got a good excuse to go up there. Although many of the hill stations in India had dedicated railways built for them, Nainital never did, and so quite a few of the hill stations are big tourist attractions, not just for European or American tourists, you know, seeing the jewel in the crown type setting, but also for Indians themselves, because for Indians it's quite a strange experience to experience a climate that's so different from that of humid Mumbai or incredibly hot Delhi. But because there's no railway to Nainital, it hasn't been commercialized and doesn't have the sort of tourist pressures that many other hill stations have in India, including Darjeeling, which I mentioned a few moments ago. And so it was quite an unusual place to visit in the fact that it still feels somewhat unspoiled by the passing of time. Its physical geography, as you can see, very steep hillsides surrounding it. It's very difficult to develop, whereas various other hill stations tend to have sprawled quite a lot, with the very rapid increase in the population of India. So it retains quite a lot of sort of oldie worldy charm, really. And so on this lake here, you'd often see scullers in their rowing boats going back and forth along. There's still a Rotary Club and little sailing club and so on. The church where Orwell's parents were married in is at the head of that lake. So if you look at that photograph, it's at the top end as you see it in the middle there, over on the left. A vast Anglican church, which I was told was built for 1,000 worshippers. And obviously the Anglican community in Nainital is now very, very small, and they don't worship there, but they worship in another small chapel that is actually closer to the side of where I was taking the photograph there. So Nainital, I just felt for its beauty was a very, very interesting place to visit. I did ask for whether there are any records, say sort of the marital registers for the church, and because I have some experience of Indian institutions, particularly in Calcutta, I know Indian institutions tend to not throw anything out, so everything's just kept in a room somewhere, moulding away forever. That's been my experience anyway in Kolkata, and so I sort of had the feeling that the registers, the marital registers, and so on would be somewhere. But anyway, I was told there was nothing. But I met somebody in a bookshop giving a talk in Totnes in November. What's it? No, sorry, September. And to my astonishment, she said she had also been to Nainital, not because of Orwell, but because her grandparents also met and married in Nainital. And she revealed to me that there are registers, and so they do exist, and she knew who to contact to get them. But the Anglican rector that showed me around the town, who had only recently been appointed, said there was nothing. So make of that what you will, but there is a possibility that there are intact registers showing the marriage. The next photograph is the place of birth. So this is the Orwell bungalow. I know some people on the call, trustees, have visited. This was a compound of the originally of the East India Company for the production of opium. Lots of quirky, quite horrifying historical facts were revealed to me as I researched this. So as late as 1918, something like a fifth of the taxation revenues of British India came from opium. So it was an incredibly significant export crop for the government, the British government of India. And I don't think it. I don't think we can say that the claim. I don't think we can claim it was the collapse of that industry because the Chinese banned its imports from 1918, 1919 onwards. I don't think it is invalid to say that the collapse of that industry and some of the other export industries in British India is one of the reasons why Britain increasingly said, alongside the rise of Indian nationalism, is this somewhere we want to stay? Is it worth maintaining this when the taxation revenues had collapsed as a result of the opium trade? But Orwell's father, or Blair's father, really was part of an interesting economic process, and one that has received really scant or not enough attention in history as I would think is necessary. But the bungalow, as many will know, is very well cared for. It's cared for by the Rotary Club of Motihari. There's a bust, although albeit not quite really resembling Orwell in his truest form, but nevertheless, I thought it was very endearing. As you might expect, very few people make the journey, owing mainly to the difficulty of getting there. So the people that I spoke to, the group of students who spoke English in the vicinity of the home, said it's about 3 or 4 people a month that visit. There was lots of strange coincidences during my journey through the life of George Orwell, and one of them is shown in the next photograph. So as I came to the end of the lane, which one has to walk along to get to the Blair bungalow, as I came to the end of the lane, I was sort of somewhat startled because I saw a working elephant coming around. This is a chowk, or this is the edge of a roundabout. Chowk is a roundabout circular area in India. And obviously, because I had lived in India before, working elephants are not something you see very often. They're not. It's not like shooting elephant days where there'd be a working elephant in every town and village. And I'd never seen one before in India in all of my travels in the subcontinent. So when I saw one, I thought, having just come from the Blair bungalow, I thought that was quite amusing. So I explained that in some detail, given the link, obviously, to the magisterial quality of descriptions in Shooting an Elephant. So from India to Chile, England, I'm sure many people on the call will recognise this as being the Blair home in Shiplake. The Badacom book was very, very helpful for me, Eric and us. I'm sure that will also be familiar to some people on the call. Not only because of its factual descriptions, but also it really is a beautiful book, I think, as a reflection of childhood and the relationship between children well, it could be set anywhere. Obviously, specifically, it was in relation to the relationship between the Badacons and Eric Blair and the Blair family. And I did one of the methodological challenges I had was this strange dichotomy between seeing working elephants around a chowk in Motihari, and then standing outside a fairly ordinary English mock let's call it mock Edwardian property in commuter belt Berkshire, and obviously that change in environment was quite a hallmark of the life of Eric Blair and of Orwell. If we think about the decision to go to Marrakesh, his love of Paris as a man in his 20s, so that desire for a change in environment, I felt, was a clear hallmark of his life, although that won't be news to many people on the call, I'm sure. But I think it would be news to many of the target audience that I've been hoping to reach. I was hosted at Eton for 2 days in it was at the end of coming to the end of a summer term, and this was my favourite source that I saw. So it was a book that was Eton being such an old, venerable institution. There were lots of a lot of the archive associated with Orwell has been discovered accidentally. And I got a feeling this was one of them. I can't remember the exact details, but it is in the book. But I think this book was found in the early 1970s in one of the houses at Eton, the houses being where pupils are based when they're not in classes. And I don't think it was discovered in college. College was Eric Blair's house. But anyway, it turned up in one of the houses at Eton, and Michael Meredith, who was long-standing head of English at Eton, and he's taught at Eton since the 1960s. He still works there, though I gather he's not so well at the moment. But at the time that I visited, he was the librarian of College Library, which is the exclusive library that only the King's scholars can use. And I don't think it was discovered in the college house. I think it was discovered in another random house. Obviously, this is a charming drawing. Maybe somebody on the call can clarify. I don't know whether he drew that himself, but the idea that he drew it himself, I think, is very attractive. So that was the book. So now, it's obviously the strange dichotomy of the life of George Orwell, now back in Myanmar. One thing I should say about the chapter on Myanmar, at the time that I visited Myanmar, the British Foreign Office had a lot of, was doubling its presence in the country, great anticipation of a very, very vibrant, exciting economic future, lots of discussions about trade. I fell in with a group. I knew a friend of a friend was based in the embassy when I was there, and she introduced me to lots of people, and they said, this, Myanmar's going to be the next Singapore. This is so exciting. And of course, subsequently, we know that was not the case. Myanmar is now closed to visitors again. And thus, again, this was not an intention of the chapter on Myanmar, but it has become a consequence of circumstances that the chapter on Myanmar in the book is really a snapshot of Myanmar, Burma, at a specific point in time, and one that cannot be repeated by definition, because if Myanmar or Burma opens up again in the coming decades, it will obviously be a changed socioeconomic the circumstances will have evolved again. So my gut tells me that actually my chapter on Myanmar and Burma at that point in time will actually be quite an interesting source for future researchers. This is the Pegu Club I mentioned earlier. So as you can see, in a state of quite extraordinary dereliction, very much felt, I think I described this in the chapter, but sort of felt as if the jungle was starting to engulf it again and to take it over. I described it as, I don't know if anyone on the call remembers A Night to Remember, but it's the black and white 1950s film about the sinking of the Titanic, which, because my mother's family is from Liverpool, that film, something I'd seen at a very young age. And so the breaking boards in the ceiling reminded me instantly of the Titanic. And because I visited during a big storm, there's water coming out of every orifice. It did have, and because the quality of craftsmanship was also so high, you see the Doric columns, lots of mahogany and teak. So yeah, it sort of felt as if I was walking walking around a raised Titanic. It was quite a visually memorable experience in my tour of the life of George Orwell. This is the ballroom in the same club, which again could easily resemble one of the posh stateroom, posh public areas on the Titanic. This is one of the funnest moments of the tour, and again quite unusual circumstances. So that those are my legs lying on top of a minibus in upstate Burma. Myanmar never had a railway network developed in the same way as the rest of India, mainly because Myanmar was integrated into British India at a much later date, which also explains why its institutions were quite weak and why Blair, I think, felt so insecure in his job there, because the duties of providing law and order in Myanmar were so challenging, because the local population obviously resented this alien presence, this alien colonial presence. Anyhow, so the railways aren't so well developed, and so minibuses are the main way of transportation. So to get to Kata, which was the setting for Burmese Days, I had to join one of these minibuses, and I was the last person in Mandalay to get on this minibus, and then we stopped about an hour and a half into the journey, and there was an elderly couple that had to go and see a doctor, and I was by far the youngest person in the bus, and the only person who spoke English in the minibus said, someone has to go on top, and they sort of implied that it would have to be the young British person that was in it. So I said, okay, that's fine. I'll take the hit. So that's how I ended up on top of the minibus, which was actually safer than it seems, because there were those bars around the edges, and the minibus the roads aren't terribly good, so it wasn't sort of the equivalent of being on a minibus going up the M6 or anything. So that was one of the more memorable moments. Again, another memorable moment, and also quite a moving one. This was Blair's house in Kata, and for those who have been, I'm sure they will understand that many of the features of Burmese Days are there as if the novel could be recreated in safari style. And there are plans to do that. They may have come to fruition now. But the founder of Carter Heritage Trust, who I got to know quite well during my visit there, told me that was their eventual intention. So that the club that is so well described in the novel is very little. It's no longer a club, but the physical building is very much preserved as it was in Blair's time in the early 1920s. As indeed is his police house. So the house that Blair lived in is still a government of Burma, government of Myanmar police house. So the sight of that truck on the drive there, I just thought to be very pleasing. This isn't in the book, but I just thought it was quite funny, because it's sort of a mistranslation from Burmese into English. But there's a very famous bridge in Burma that's a sort of cast iron, very high girder bridge that crosses a very deep ravine, and tourists cross the bridge and then they just come back because it's such an experience to cross it. And the railway staff had used the word guess. So number 131 up train arrive 7:52 a.m. guess. Of course, they should really have said estimate or some other word, but I thought the use it was just a funny moment of mistranslation there. But not in the books. That's sort of a special slide. Back to cold, rainy England. Obviously, I'm sure everyone on the call recognise this as Book Lovers Corner, the significance of I had worked in a bookshop in the sixth form, and so I had some insight into the book-selling trade through that job, and yeah, a funny side note that when I first read Bookshop Memories, which I read long before this journey began, I actually posted it to the staff of the bookshop I used to work in, which was the Orwell bookshop in Brackley in South Northamptonshire. And many, one of the great appeals of Orwell's work, to my mind, and the reason he remains so popular and his work resonates so powerfully with so many people all over the world, is that many of his observations don't seem to have dated terribly, which is some achievement given he was writing, 80, 90 years ago. Anyhow, I sent Bookshop Memories to some of my old colleagues in the bookshop, and it was so accurate and so on point that they put it on their notice board, and it's still there all these years later. So that was that my visit to Bookshop Book Lovers Corner was quite a pleasant one. Actually, the book launch for the Orwell tour was at Daunt Books, about 7 or 8 shops to the right. So that was quite a nice evening for the launch back in July. Again, probably familiar to many people on the call, the stores in Wallington. I should, I think, comment on the Anna Funder controversy a little bit. I had a exchange of letters, but my book and hers were reviewed together in the Times Literary Supplement, and the writer was actually relatively favourable to my work because she said I quite truthfully, faithfully represent the role of the women in George Orwell's life, and of course Anna Funder's book, in her opinion, had done a very good job of doing that as well in terms of advocating the underrepresented and so on. But I think, just commenting, and in my letter to the TLS, what I did say was that I think one of the claims Anna Funder makes is that Eileen was dragged along to this horrible cottage that didn't have central heating, didn't have an indoor lavatory, how awful damp conditions that Orwell forced Eileen to endure. But of course, it was quite easy for her to say that in a very large villa in Melbourne or in a very wealthy suburb of Sydney. I grew up in an English village, and even in my childhood in the 1990s, there were still plenty of houses like the Stores that didn't have central heating, and even one or two, even then, that didn't have an indoor lavatory or bathroom. This is 1997, 1998 type thing. So I think it's very unfair of Funder to assume that the conditions that Orwell and Eileen experienced at the Stores were, terribly eccentric and unusual, because I know factually that they were not terribly eccentric or unusual for the 1930s. So it's just some of that contextualization I think would be helpful in terms of those debates. This is at Monflorite in Spain, and I love this. So this is across the square from one of the hospitals Orwell was treated in Catalonia, and the president. I mean, somebody asked me, one of the questions I get asked a lot is which place has changed the most in terms of Orwell's life, and people are very surprised when I give the answer that it's probably Britain, because Britain, when Orwell was born, was obviously the most powerful country in the world, one of if not the richest countries in the world, very certain, very cognizant of its power and its influence, and of course over the following 120 years, that position has changed beyond all recognition to many people. And equally, Spain, I think, would probably be number 2 in my list of most changed places, because over the course of that time, Spain's living standards are almost the same as Britain's, which I think would surprise anybody, even from the perspective, say, of 1985, when Spain was a recently joined member of the European Union and one of the poorest members of the European Union. I mean, from the perspective of the 1930s, to think that Spain would be almost as rich per person as Britain, I think it'd be very difficult for Orwell to comprehend that at that time. But nevertheless, the Civil War damage, which applied to this church, is still there. So that's why I thought this was quite an interesting photograph to show an insight into Blair's experience of the war in Spain. This is more the travelogue aspect of the book, but it was I wanted to get some sweet pastry, and I visited a cafe in Marrakesh, and I think I'd already ordered a croissant, and then I looked down and it was filled full of flies, and I rapidly decided not to buy the pain au chocolat or whatever it was. So yeah, just the more sort of humorous aspect of my travels. There is Richard at the unveiling of the Orwell statue, which I joined as well. I think there was an invitation to Orwell Society members to go, and so I use this photograph in the talks I give in bookshops to discuss Orwell's time at the BBC. And they also always like the fact that a lot of BBC staff like to smoke it's one of the main smoking spots for BBC staff. I won't go into in the talks I give in bookstores. I go into his experience at the BBC, but I'm sure most people on call will be aware of his feelings of the BBC as an institution, and so on. This is maybe familiar. This is the Ardlusa House on Jura. And this is right at the beginning of my travels, where I didn't really know what I was doing. What am I doing here? I'm on this remote Scottish island. But the room that I stayed in was, I was told by the Fletchers, the room that Eric Blair used to stay in. And I very much liked it's just the sense of geological presence on Jura, because the fact that Scotland is rising, there's all these raised beaches on the coastline of Jura, which Orwell himself commented on, particularly on the west coast of Jura. And so this great sense of being immersed in geological past in the Hebrides was something that I felt very, very, very powerful. One of the very interesting things I thought about Ardlusa House was the visitor's book. To see Eric Blair's entry, May the 22nd, Eric Blair, Barnhill, Jura, which I think the visitor's book is only just in its second volume. And they don't, I think they would like more visitors. Maybe my book will usher more people to Barnhill and to Ardlusa House. I don't think we want to see it inundated, but I got the impression they would like more people on the Orwell Trail than they'd received. But even today, it is still quite inaccessible, particularly if Calmac is having problems, or there's lots of swell on the Sound of Jura. And I think that's the final slide. Yes, it is. So obviously that's then that is another site that's be familiar to many people on the call, which is obviously the grave site. I did feel very emotional, actually, in the final approach to the grave, because I always knew it would be ending there. So it was always in my mind that I would end up, standing before the grave of George. I'm sure other people on the call that have gone on the Orwell Society trips to the grave again feel this sense of attachment and emotion. Yeah, that's probably where I will end. I will say that during throughout the whole process of the research for every trip, re-experiencing Orwell's experiences in these places, and his life, only my respect for Orwell only ever became greater as that process went on. My next book is, I'm going to do what I did for George Orwell for John Steinbeck. I'm already quite well into the travel and the research for that. John Steinbeck is a much less likable character, obviously as well known, probably in terms of in literary terms, millions of books sold and all the rest of it. But I feel with the Orwell book, I liked him more and more, respected him more and more as I went through his life. With Steinbeck, I'm already sensing I've got great respect for his work, but as a person, my respect seems to be ebbing away somewhat. Anyhow, I'll pass over to questions presently.
Well, thank you very much, Oliver. One or two things, if you contact me afterwards, I can update you on.
Yes, please. Yeah,
questions you raised. Who would like to ask the first question of Oliver? If you could use the hands raised thing, then you appear in order of asking on my screen. Ground everybody to a halt. Bob, pleased to meet you. Could you unmute, please?
I'm unmuting myself.
You are now, yeah.
Does that work? Good to see you.
Say that Bob will be giving a George talk later next year.
Oliver, nice to see you. I'm the Canadian ambassador to the UN, and like you, I think we're all here because we're lifelong admirers of Orwell, and you've given us a fascinating perspective. I have to say that every once in a while somebody writes a book and said, "Gee, that would have been an interesting book to try and write to go through those travels." I very much agree with you about Emma Larkin's extraordinary books on Myanmar. One of them about with Orwell, the other one about her, Nobody Tell the King, or I think that's what it's called. But I'm not sure you're right about one comment that you made about trying to write about Orwell without writing about the politics. I mean, to me, it's sort of like you can't do that in a way. I know that sometimes the politics is tendentious, but it's sort of hard. I'm just wondering if you've got any comments on the book Orwell's Roses, which sort of did a little bit of what you did, but didn't get to India, didn't cover all the ground. Do you have a view about that book, or a sense of where you would put it in the pantheon
I can,
that you would like
remain
like
polite on Orwell's Roses? No, I wasn't a fan at all of that book, for two reasons. I felt you're quite right. I mean, she I suppose half-heartedly tried to do what I did, but a lot of her research was sort of based on almost writing a Lonely Planet guide, but doing it from from your desk rather than actually going there and experiencing it for herself. And I think methodologically, Orwell's Roses doesn't work very well in that respect, because she keeps saying there are lots of loose ends that she can't clarify because she didn't go, and she was relying on emails.
Right.
Whereas I think the fact I did go to all of those places answered questions I would have had I not gone. I still had some questions, one of which, for instance, the house the Blairs had in Marrakesh. I say in the book, I tried to find it, I couldn't. Subsequently, as Quinta, we've now discovered that the house, I thought I had suspected it had been demolished, but we now have confirmation that it was. So that's sort of the method of Orwell's Roses, I think, is partly its undoing. I actually quite like gardening and garden design, and I don't really think she did as much justice to Orwell's love of flora and fauna as she could have done. And then the lacing over with her political positions, I just feel there's no need for it. As I say, I think you say you can't ignore the politics, but Orwell's commentary on politics and strictly of European politics, British politics, Spanish politics, what have you, is obviously very much age specific now. So we can treat his assessment of those political discussions through the lens of historical methodology. We don't need to. It doesn't need to be contentious. Where Orwell is relevant politically now is his remarkably insightful assessment of the relationship between the citizen and the state. But that's the realm, obviously, of political theory, not of current affairs or politics. That is seriously interesting and incredibly revelatory in its analysis. Another example would be his notes on nationalism, where he makes a very clear and interesting distinction between nationalism and patriotism. So for me, if I was to write a political book about George Orwell, that's what I would focus on. I wouldn't focus on what would George Orwell have thought about Brexit.
So what are you doing your thesis? What are you doing your thesis on?
Totally different. My privatization's on. My thesis on the privatization of British Rail. So very, very different to George Orwell.
But an Orwellian event in and of itself.
Well, a disaster story.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, Kafkaesque maybe would be better a description. But yeah. But no, I don't think George Orwell. He didn't even live to see Britain join the European community. So commenting on what he would have thought about Brexit, I just felt not appropriate. So
no, I agree with you. I agree with you about that. I agree with you about saying that what would Orwell have thought about this or that, or was he a man? Trying to make up stuff about whether he was a man of the left or the right, but only that. And I think that the thing that's really really interesting in your book is the way you revisit. While also sort of accounting for where we are now and how things have changed, and also in some sense how things have not changed. And I think that's a very powerful observation that you're making. I've spoken long enough, but thank you,
very
Quentin.
much.
Good to meet you.
Very interesting question.
Good to see you.
Thank you, Bob. I have to say I disagree with you. I enjoyed Orwell's Roses, Oliver, but we'll move on. Glenn, please.
Well, at least I started a debate anyway.
Good. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Glenn, please.
I could get into Orwell on Brexit as a supporter of the United Socialist States of Europe. I think Orwell's views on Brexit are pretty clear. But what I want to ask about is, in a sense, a slight gap. I mean, it's always like that. It's always, where didn't you visit? And what intrigued me is Orwell in Gibraltar, because Orwell spent several weeks in Gibraltar on his way to Marrakesh.
To Marrakesh, yes. Yeah.
But of course, he was in Gibraltar when the Spanish Civil War was still continuing. It was very, very active politically. So it's almost a kind of, it's a kind of bridge. And it's very difficult to find out anything about that he did there. But clearly, he was doing something. He was not there. And one wonders what relationship he had with, it's politics again, but with the Republicans are actually in exile in Gibraltar and all the rest. And it seems to me that really fits both with Spain as a bridge and Marrakesh. So
yeah, I mean, I do comment on that in the chapter on Marrakesh, because as many on the call know, Orwell was very worried that he was passing through Spanish Morocco to get to Marrakesh. Obviously, I think the interesting thing about Gibraltar, and that never occurred to me, it's a very interesting observation you make, the fact that he stopped off in Gibraltar, which of course is a British colony. He would not have been alarmed or worried about Spanish secret agents or whatever taking him out. So I think you're right. There's a very interesting story there to be told. I'm sure the Orwell Society, or if maybe someone, Quentin, has anyone picked up on that before?
Well, Kevin can confirm this, Kevin Carter, but I don't think he spent weeks there. I think it was a travel hiccup, because the boat went to Morocco, then went to Gibraltar, and then he had to go back again. It was not something that he spent time there, I don't think, did he, Kevin? Are you there, Kevin? Maybe he's not. But he was definitely very, very concerned when he was on the trains in Spanish Morocco. But as it was, it all passed without incident. Well, the only incident was that they had their luggage mislaid, which eventually turned up again.
That's a familiar story to us all, isn't it? But I mean, on the travel point, because I'm going through some Steinbeck. Steinbeck lived into the jet engine age, so he could travel quite relatively cheaply and freely around the world, which makes my job quite difficult because he could get around a lot more than Orwell did. But obviously, did Orwell ever take an aeroplane? Is that known, Quentin?
Yes, he did. He took an aeroplane. He was flown back when Eileen died by the RAF. In fact,
right, Paris.
I can't remember the.
Very interesting.
No, from Germany.
From Germany, right?
I can't remember the detail now, but one of our members looked up the records of the RAF squadron that would have managed that, and I know he flew at least once.
But the fact he didn't live into the age of the jet engine.
Oh no, well,
Imperial Airways or whatever, or at least it was a very expensive ticket.
He didn't live into the age of jet travel.
Exactly.
He didn't live into the age of jets.
No,
because clearly the Messerschmitt jet was about, and the Meteor was and Vampire were in development.
But he was reliant on his travels on steamers and boats.
Oh yes, that's steamers and trains. Yeah, absolutely.
Trains, obviously. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
The next question.
Are you happy with that answer, Glenn? Yeah.
Yes, I think there's more to look at, but yes. I mean, I've been to Gibraltar a few times. I went to the Rock Hotel, which is the obvious hotel for him to stop at, but they don't have any records from when he was there. The other one was obviously the Bristol, but I never had time to do that. But it seems to me there's an interesting little vignette there.
No, there is. There's a short story, George Orwell in Gibraltar or something. Yeah, there's something there. No, I agree. Very interesting.
Ian, thank you, Glenn.
Good evening, and thanks very much, Oliver. Nothing, as far as I can tell, I haven't yet seen the book. But in your introduction, I don't think you mentioned Canterbury Square in Islington.
Correct. No, I didn't. And I
Wasn't that
did.
fairly central to his writing? Because
Yes.
still Islington, he was the author of some. He was a minor novelist, and he was effectively an interesting essayist whose essays were at that point published in pretty obscure magazines.
Mm.
He's also a fairly prolific book reviewer, but he hadn't made his name, and he did in the mid-40s with Animal Farm, and that's where Islington and Canterbury Square becomes central, doesn't it?
So Animal Farm was written in Maida Vale in the in Abbey Road, not in Canterbury Square. I did think about whether to have a chapter on Islington, but instead what I chose to do was to have a chapter on Fitzrovia. So I rooted the chapter on. I rooted his time in London, his later time in London, around his employment in the BBC. And that chapter actually starts in Islington because the summer that I was researching that chapter, there was the play about Sonia that had just been released, and I went, I think, to the opening night or the second night in at Angel. So there are many references to the time at Canterbury Square, but not a chapter in its own right. It's sort of woven into the Fitz.
Yeah, while the bulk of the book was written there, of course, he had to wheelbarrow it across to Canterbury Square when that house in Maida Vale was bombed.
Yeah.
So it was completed and prepared for publication in Canterbury Square.
That's right.
Oh, sorry, slight Wi-Fi hiccup there. But yes, so and obviously the final chapter on Sus Courtney, I weave in references to Islington there as well, in the last chapter.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Peter.
Since there doesn't seem to be any questions at the moment about Orwell, maybe I'll ask about Steinbeck. But first, I'll say I think you're a bit unfair, maybe because I saw her on a very heartwarming errand. I think you're a bit hard on Rebecca. It's an eccentric book, I think. I reviewed it in an academic, the Rebecca Solnit book, but she did spend a lot of time, I think, in Wellington. And she said that she had planned to go to Jura, but the pandemic didn't make it possible. So I think, and she was focusing on just one aspect. But I'm curious. I hope, well, as you probably know, there's a lot of Steinbeck material at my university, Stanford University, and Gavin Jones, who's actually English, but is a professor of English at Stanford and has written a book on Steinbeck. So I presume that you'll be coming this way, and maybe you can come and visit me.
Yes,
but
no, happily.
Why Steinbeck? I live halfway between San Francisco and Stanford.
Right. Well, I think Steinbeck, I think that there's a lot to be explored about Orwell and Steinbeck as two. They're both in the same generation. Steinbeck 1902, Orwell 1903. Their reflections on social justice, on culture. So Steinbeck, as you know, wrote hugely on America and the Americans, the life of America, and as Orwell did about England, and his book, The English People, and so on. So that there are a lot of similarities. I would love to know if they ever met, but I don't think they may have crossed over in Paris and London at some point, but I don't think there's anything that would suggest they met. But I think also
Steinbeck didn't go to Spain, I don't think.
No, he didn't. No. But they were in. I think they were in Paris. They crossed over in Paris, although they were probably there at the same time. Whether they met or not, I've no idea. I mean, maybe somebody might be able to correct me. But also, of course, it isn't just the significance of their writing when they produced their work, but it's their long run significance. And of course, Steinbeck, like Orwell, is nigh on a household name for many people, certainly in the West, but also around the world as well.
I think he's fair. I think Grapes of Wrath, I think, still has a readership, and there's an opera of Mice and Men, which is, I don't think he's forgotten, but obviously he's not. But also, it's interesting, like Orwell, he's claimed by both the right and the left.
Yes.
And I think most of us feel that Orwell is appropriately on the left, and I think Steinbeck is perhaps a bit more wobbly in terms of to what degree he was committed to the right.
Yeah, and obviously his position on Vietnam, I mean, we're digressing a little bit, but his position on Vietnam, of course, quite controversial. But so I think there's a lot in exploring their lives, and of course, doing a travelogue of Orwell, then doing a travelogue of Steinbeck, and reflecting on the method and my experiences of both, I think should end up quite an interesting book. I think on the Solent book, I just again I just sensed it was too political for me, really. I think because I'm a trained historian, I've it's been drilled into me, for going on for 20 years. Your political views don't matter. All that matters is the evidence, the context, the sense of empathy with your subject. Take your emotions out of it. So perhaps that's why I'm too harsh on Solent. I'm just there's too much historian method of the historian.
No, I think it's legitimate for our interests to shape us. I mean, that's why the interpretation of the past is continually changing, because the people who interpret it, their interests and preoccupations.
That's a valid retort. Yeah.
Any more questions, or shall we thank Oliver? In which case, I'd like you to unmute.
Well, Oliver, do be in touch with him. He stands here.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
Are you planning a trip out here?
Yeah, I haven't been to Stanford yet, but I've done Salinas.
You've been to Salinas? Yes, because it's Steinbeck country. I mean, this is Steinbeck.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no. So I've done Salinas, Monterey. Well, we would say Monterey in Britain, but obviously over the pond you'd call it Monterey, and Lake Tahoe. So I've done those 3 research trips, but I haven't yet done the archival bit. So no, I will be absolutely over.
Having in money, but not brain cells, to be honest.
You could possibly get if you in touch with Gavin Jones, say, I suggest you be in touch. I don't know when you're planning to come, but they could probably arrange for you to give a talk, and that would draw people. They probably pay you a small fee, which might be helpful, but it was also draw people who were interested in what you were doing.
Yes, yeah, no, very good point. Yeah,
very good. Well,
I'll be in touch. Yeah, thanks for
that. With your permission, Peter, I'll give Oliver your email address.
Oh, sure.
Felicia, please.
Thank you. That's Felicia Nimua, not just Felicia. Yeah. I am hardly an. Am I unmuted? I am hardly an expert on Steinbeck, although I did read The Grapes of Wrath and Of Mice and Men and his dreadful attempt to rewrite Mallory. But it seems to me a difference between Orwell and Steinbeck that's relevant here is, of course, that Steinbeck lived 19 years later. So a lot of hard issues about right versus left that Orwell never had.
I'm going to leave the call.
I could have asked the question, but
well, we've lost you a bit, I think. With the.
In fact, I'm sorry.
It's all about Steinbeck.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. There's a bit of background noise. Perhaps if other people mute.
No, there isn't any background noise here. But at least I don't think.
I think it's other people who aren't muted.
Yeah, it's
okay. Do I need to repeat what I said?
I think so. Yes. If you start again now.
Okay. Okay. I'm not an expert on Steinbeck, although I did read Of Mice and Men and The Grapes of Wrath, and also his dreadful attempt to reproduce Mallory. But he lived 19 years later, and I think as a result of that, he didn't have to make some of the hard decisions about right versus. He did have to make, some of the hard decisions about right versus left with respect to things like Vietnam that Orwell did not. So I think it's hard to compare them that way.
No, that's a very, very good point. And because he lived into, I mean, age of modernity, if you like, in terms of the jet engine and super high skyscrapers, the engineering after effects really of the technological jumps that took place during the Second World War. His life ended up being very different, but their social circumstances. I don't want to digress too much into Steinbeck, but that lower upper middle class background that Orwell writes of so much, that there are quite strong similarities with Steinbeck's social background as well, which I wonder, how that informed his Steinbeck's worldviews just as they did Orwell's. So yeah, I do think there's a lot in exploring their lives together. But irrespective of all of that, certainly in Britain, Steinbeck and Orwell, because they're both on the national curriculum, every generation of children is exposed to their work in a way, which can't even be said of the Bronte sisters or Dickens now. So the fact that both writers were analysing the changing circumstances of the 20th century, politically, technologically, economically, I think makes them very good, a good pair to pursue using the method I've adopted.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Yes, hi. I'm looking forward to getting your book. I'm in Canada, so I'm not quite sure when it'll get here, but I'll be looking for it. I'm wondering about Morocco, whether you went into the Atlas Mountains and up to Tattert, because that has been one of my fascinations of their trip, their experience with the Berber villagers and etc. Did you?
No, I didn't. And the reason for that was at the time of my visit, there had just been a very unpleasant murder of, I think, two Norwegian or Swedish travellers. So the advice was not to travel into the Atlas Mountains.
We've been up twice now, Sylvia.
Right. So they don't. The Atlas Mountains are featured, but they're not. There's no comment on Orwell's and Eileen's time there. I'm afraid that doesn't
feature.
Did
up there then on your trips? That's good.
We actually found the hotel they stayed in, and you'll remember that Eileen talks about picking walnuts from the roof. Liz picked walnuts from the same tree.
Oh, when am I going to hear about that? Have you written up that trip? I'd love to hear about it.
We're both on the exploratory trip in 22 and this year when we took the full group out.
Because I did some research into the woman, who's called a prostitute that Orwell saw.
Yeah.
I met
in Marrakesh itself, the brothel.
No, in Tattert.
Oh, in the Atlas Mountains, right.
And I met a Berber woman in Toronto, a Moroccan woman from the Berber group who was traveling in Toronto. I asked her about that. And she said that woman would not be, there were no prostitutes. It was the whole sexual attitude there amongst that culture, was quite different. And she assumed it was probably the daughter, believe it or not, of the hotel keeper who offered his daughter to Orwell when he asked if there was someone he could have an affair with, or whatever you want to call it. So she assured me, she looked very much, she had the beautiful woman with they used certain black ash on their eyes to make their eyes look bigger, which dimensions, the size of her eyes. So if I were up there, I'd try to look into that a little bit more, what the Berber culture is now.
Well, like Tickleton Court, it may end up, when I get there in 10 years or something, I can add it in as a little addendum. But it is on sale in the US, so it is definitely stocked in some bookstores for definite.
Okay.
So yeah,
ask your daughter to buy it, Sylvia.
Pardon?
Ask your daughter to buy it in New York.
Oh yeah, I'll try to get the library to order it too.
I should say the book was read by an English professor at University of North Carolina, and he picked it up in a bookstore at Cape Hatteras, the Barrier Islands, North Carolina. Anyhow, he emailed me because one of his colleagues is organised. I don't know if this is. I keep meaning to email in Quinton, but there's going to be an Orwell colloquium in April at the University of North Carolina.
Right.
They've invited me to talk, so I'm going. But if that wasn't on the Orwell Society's radar, it is now. So yeah, April the 17th, I think, is the date.
I think that'll be the week after we're in Paris. Right. Well, in that case, if you can send me details of it, I will let our American membership know.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, it's been a terrific evening. We've had an hour and a half of very interesting evening. I think it's time now to thank Oliver for his time and talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming.